Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is a champion of Americana in games. Trained as a graphic designer, he worked in newspapers, becoming the art director of the Washington Post 4 months before 9/11. In board games, he's most well known for being the founder and president of Dice Hate Me Games, which specialises in games with that Norman Rockwell feel. He also hosts 2 podcasts, The Geek All-Stars and The State of Games. My guest this week is Chris Kirkman. Chris, welcome to the cabin.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So my first question is then, how difficult was it for you to pick the 5 games to take to the cabin?
Oh, good grief. It was excruciating because, I have just currently over 220 games on my to sell list, much less my to keep list. So, yeah, it's a nightmare.
And it seems to me, from listening to the podcast, you're not just a gamer, you're not just a collector, but you're someone who sort of revels in the history and the lore of the industry. And so,
absolutely,
do you see your games as sort of historical artifacts as much as things to play?
I do. I think that with mine, what's interesting is the aesthetics are not only reflect my interests, but also sort of my design aesthetic as well. Retro Americana is sort of my niche. And, I don't know. That sounds, it's a little lofty to say like, oh, well, there are matters of artifacts or history, but they kind of are. And not only in the fact in the future, people might look back on them, but they're also a snapshot of pieces of history, of American history.
And I'm one of these people. I go on podcasts and I say stupid things, but I recently wrote an article saying essentially components in games are completely inconsequential, and art is completely inconsequential because games are a mechanical art form. How wrong am I?
Oh, that? Very, very wrong. And I think that you realize that you're partially wrong. I understand exactly what you're saying. And we had that same argument, I believe. It was probably on the State of Games a while back when we talked to Matt Riddle. Matt Riddle has a very similar Matt Riddle and Ben Pinchback, obviously the designers of Fleet and many other games. But Matt Riddle always has that argument of the game is about playing the game as the mechanics. And so, we put him to the challenge and said well, don't components make games better? Doesn't art make games better? By the end, he had come around and said, yes, in some instances they do. And I believe the same thing. But there are some games where it's just the art and the theme are inconsequential. You're just playing it for the mechanics.
So let's go back to the beginning then. So where did you grow up, and to what extent do you think that shaped the person you are today?
Well, I grew up in a little small rural town in the center of North Carolina. You can probably, a lot of your listeners can hear that in my voice now. I try not to get too southern with my accent, but it shaped me, I think, primarily because it was such a small town and I was also an only child. I was had a lot of mental pursuits, and games were one of those things that challenged me, not only playing them, but also thinking about their structure. I would take games and without even, just as a second nature, improve their mechanics. I would say well, this should be played this way, or we should make a game that's similar to this game, but, what I would call better. And that's similar to what I do today. You take a design, you work with the designer, but you think about how can you elevate that gameplay and make it a better game. And my mom was always one to play games with me, so she instilled sort of that sense of wonder in games. And because, obviously since it's a small town and there's only so many things to do in a small town, I think that did influence my pursuits and the way that I am today, for sure.
And, when we live in sort of generalities and we often live in stereotypes, and when we think of the South in America, we think of, a certain a certain ethos, but also certain problems, especially when it comes to things like race relations. I mean, to what degree is that still true of the South in America?
It's interesting. As a kid, well, there's a couple of personal stories. My parents were very open, and we had, obviously, in a small rural town, we only had I guess we'll focus mostly on the race relations for African Americans because we didn't have any Asian families in our hometown. But I never knew the difference. I was never taught to have any sort of those prejudices, but I saw them. You would see them. Something happened in our church, and my dad didn't like that. He actually removed us from our church when I was smaller because of something that was said in the church in that manner. And I give that to my dad. He was very brave to do that, and also to make a stand against that. Now, yeah, obviously today I think that race relations probably are better. But it's interesting going down that road you're talking about. The South does have that preconceived notion of that, but it is it happens everywhere. It happens very often in dense urban areas, in the North, like Chicago and places like that. Today, I think that the relations are definitely better because as when I grew up, it was in the 70s. So this was, 15, 20 years after desegregation. But again, growing up, I had no prejudices. I didn't see anything until I got a little older and I started to understand what people were saying. And some people, of course, had those prejudices. But you're right about stereotypes. It's tough because, the South has stereotypes of other, means as well, rather than just race relations. And to kind of get past those stereotypes is something that you want to try to push, especially because, of where you grew up and how you want people to perceive not only yourself, but those that have surrounded you, your friends and family.
And, it seems to me we've seen recently, the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and it seems the Mason-Dixon line is still very, very strong in denoting attitudes within America. How is it to live in the South in such fraught times? Do you just avoid talking about it, or are there endless discussions, endless arguments?
It's frustrating. It really is because, just to give you an idea, because I live in Chapel Hill. This is the Research Triangle. This is outside of Boston. We have the largest collection of PhDs in the country. So, we are very elevated. We call it the bubble. This area is very, liberal and, open. So living here is slightly different than, for instance, where I grew up or living in somewhere very, very rural country, North Carolina. But it is, as far as you're talking about the Mason-Dixon line, yes, there is a certain, it's hard to deny those red state lines. The South is definitely one of those. I think that the South is moving further into the Southwest than it is even the Southeast now, but it's frustrating because, talking about it, yes, I do talk about it. There are some instances on Facebook. There are just people that you just can't reach and you just have to just walk away for the most part. But the other day I was talking on Facebook. I have been registered independent my entire life. As a journalist, it's very important for my creed to view things objectively and to report the news and to view the news objectively. But when it comes to all of this that's been happening lately here in America with attacks against personal freedoms, that also is something that I care about, obviously. So it's tough. I mean, I even said the other day on Facebook, I posted, I said I was considering registering as Democrat. Now, ultimately, I will remain independent because I think that it allows me to still vote that way, but still maintain that creed that I have as a journalist. But it can be very frustrating.
And so you mentioned the Research Triangle there, and it's amazing. I speak to people. Isaac Shalev is someone that I think of the top of my head, and it seems to me that there's a huge game design cabal in North Carolina. Why is that?
I really don't know, other than the fact that this area does attract, I mean, this is going to sound very stereotypical, but it does attract, a certain person, more, I won't say more intelligent, but an intelligentsia to put it in a certain way, because we have the research triangle, we have tech here, we have a lot of those jobs that, stereotypes or not, tend to attract the gamers. People who are into games, who are into, not only role playing, but tabletop, video games, things like that. We have a lot. We have, several video game companies here as well. I think that has translated into a little pocket of like-minded people who are fascinated with the design portion of games, and not only that, but gamers in general. So I think this area has fostered a community, and with Isaac even moving here, it's like more and more people are moving to this area that we know from the community and have started to become part of this community. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, but I don't quite. It doesn't quite shock me, considering the type of area that we live in.
So you studied graphic design at university. Why go into that area?
Well, originally, this is kind of a funny story. I'll try to keep it short. But when I entered UNC Chapel Hill, I was a psychology major. I wanted to study psychology, and what I would do with that after UNC was beyond me right then. There was plenty of different options. But I took my first psychology class my first freshman semester, and I realized they were going to ruin me for life. So my my first love really, besides going into psychology, was journalism. I was on the high school newspaper. I liked photography, so I decided to switch my major quickly over my freshman year to journalism, and was going to focus on photojournalism. I was a photographer for the Daily Tar Heel, which is a student newspaper. And then, but before I could get into our main photography class, it was full that semester that I was going to try to take it. So I decided to take the graphic design class instead. And I just instantly fell in love. It was just a perfect fit for me. I've always been about aesthetics. I've realized kind of like, my visual language and what I like. I was always influenced by mid-century modern design and obviously retro Americana, things like that. Graphic design allowed me to express myself creatively. See, I'm not a traditionally trained artist, so I can't sit down with a brush or a pencil and churn out something that's going to look, like a regular artist would. But the computer allows me gives me the tools to do things that I want to creatively that I couldn't normally do in a more traditional medium. So I just fell into graphic design. And of course, since it was part of the journalism school and I really did like journalism, graphic design also allowed me to specialize in information graphics and explaining things to people with an economy of language and with a journalistic sensibility that just fit.
And so you've spoken about, playing games with your mum when you were a kid, but when did hobby games enter your life, and what were the first ones that really, got into your blood? I would call my quote unquote deep hobby gateway game back in the day was in 1984. And that was when I was in Hungate's hobby and craft store. They're no longer around. Unfortunately, they were a chain. I saw a little black, looked like almost like a modern VHS cassette tape box. And on the front of it, it said Car Wars. And I was like, that sounds fascinating. So I bought it, read through it, started playing it with my friends, and we were off to the races. The hobby industry, to me, from Steve Jackson Games, was wide open. It introduced me to much more complex rule sets. And that was really when it started to click for me. And I started seeking more of those hobby type games. But yeah, that was it. And then Milton Bradley introduced Axis and Allies and Fortress America and what used to be called Shogun, but now I think is referred to as Samurai Swords. Those were the more complex ones that you could find in Toys R Us and things. So I bought all of those. And of course, those were more hobby games that were trying to get into the mainstream. Well, giving nothing away, we'll come back to Car Wars later.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting, if people listen to your podcast, is you don't just talk about games. You talk about gaming in its totality, which is also kind of, the history of it and what it is as a cultural artifact. And you strike me as a
an American who's very into Euro games, I mean, what effect did the Euro invasion have on the American gaming landscape, do you think?
Well, very much like the Beatles, it kind of changed everything. We have that sort of, we have what we call, I guess we co-opted the term Ameritrash, but that's just, being tongue in cheek. But the American centric design of games is very different than Euro games. I think it had a huge change on the American gaming landscape because there were some people who would play some of the more American centric games that were looking for something more, or looking for something possibly slightly more cerebral. And obviously the European style games provided that, obviously one of the first being Catan. I think that most people probably encountered that game first more than anything else. Catan and Carcassonne were two of the big ones that people were introduced to initially. And it changed a lot because it showed people, at least gamers who wanted more out of their games, that there was more than Monopoly and Risk, and even the more complex like Axis and Allies and things like that. That there was something, and also games that don't necessarily have to deal with dice, although there is a die in Catan. But there are dice. They're not dice in Carcassonne, so people could see more than that. But it opened up the door for more of that, and also the hobby gaming landscape in general. Like, you go to a hobby store or a comic game shop, you'd start to see more and more of those European games showing up. It had a huge impact.
So your first game then is Alien Frontiers. And this was pretty much the game that launched board games on Kickstarter. To what extent what they did with Alien Frontiers, how did that go on to inspire you sort of professionally within games?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. So back in 2010, so David McKenzie was running Clever Mojo Games at the time. He started that and decided to launch Alien Frontiers. That around the same time that Michael Mendez with Tasty Minstrel Games ran Eminent Domain. Both of those games were huge. I mean, huge for the time. Now we look at how much they made and we're thinking, well, that's just the beginning.
It's something like $60,000, right, for Alien Frontiers?
I think it's less than that. I think it might be 30. Because actually Carnival, we were back in the day when we launched Carnival in 2011, we were like number 5 of all time gaining money, and we were 36,000. So the Wild West days of Kickstarter, we were fantastic, obviously, because they were viable for us. What was, I guess, it influenced as to what I do today is that I started covering the Kickstarter beat on the DiceHateMe.com, which is my game evangelism blog. That's what I started first. And I interviewed David McKenzie after they had finished with Alien Frontiers, and we became good friends, and we started talking back and forth. And he was very much a mentor as far as answering a lot of my questions as to how Kickstarter might work and shipping and so on. And so it just influenced by the summer of 2011, I was like, why not take a chance, and started Dice Hate Me Games. And we launched Carnival, and I had $5,000 in saving, and I put my funny goal as I needed $5,000 more in order to make sure that it was viable enough to send out to backers with shipping and so on and so forth. And again, like I mentioned, I think we made over around $36,000, which I was just blown away. It was a good campaign, and we did a really good job of leading up and letting people know that it was there. But the Alien Frontiers was the gateway for Kickstarter. It was the gateway for Kickstarter for a lot of people, and I think that in some ways, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but in some ways, both DiceHateMe.com and our podcast State of Games were gateways for a lot of people as well, because we did a couple different podcasts that talked about what you should think about doing Kickstarter and how to go about building your community and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was the beginning. I mean, Alien Frontiers was the thing.
And how does it play today? Does it still feel fresh?
I think that it does to me. I mean, it's tough because some people are just say like, well, that's the nostalgia factor kicking in. But I really like Alien Frontiers. I will never turn down a game. I do think that there are a couple of small things that could be changed, and some of the expansions do fix that. The race aspect doesn't resonate with some people. They get to the end, they say, well, there's no end game scoring. It's just the first person to reach, X points. And I'm like, well, yes, but that's just the nature of the game. You've got to really step it up and make sure. But there are some times, I mean, it's rare, but there are some times where somebody can just blow you out of the water and you have no chance. But for the most part, for me, I think Alien Frontier still feels fresh, and it still is a lot of fun to play. It just is.
And, you mentioned, back in the Wild West of Kickstarter. I mean, and now Kickstarter is, I mean, as much a pre-order store as it is sort of, facilitating people's dreams. Do you lament the loss of that sort of naive Kickstarter world?
I do. It's a double-edged sword on that one, because I think that a majority of the people on Kickstarter now are more savvy, which is good and bad, but good because, they know what they're looking for. But at the same time, because there's more people who've been on Kickstarter longer, they're expecting a certain level of things. Back in the day, you could have an idea and a couple of pieces of art, and people would be like, yeah, this sounds cool, because Kickstarter was supposed to be for people who have ideas to make them happen. And you're right. A lot of things nowadays is the idea is already fully formed. Your game is probably 90% done, and it's going to be a sort of a pre-order situation. I think that's missing the point of a lot of what Kickstarter's, origins and roots were all about. I don't know. It's tough because the other thing about the double-edged sword part about it is back in the Wild West days, there were a lot of campaigns that just didn't know what they were doing. So a lot of backers just got stuck with no product and lost their money. There were a lot of those back in the day. Nowadays, very rare.
So I want to talk now about your life in newspapers. So you spent 14 years traveling up the East Coast of America working in newspaper offices. So my first question is, because, I'm something of a bumpkin. I mean, to what extent are newsrooms like the things we see in the movies, All the President's Men and all of that sort of stuff?
Well, it's interesting. It depends on the movie, obviously. Some movies are a little bit more fantastical, like Sleepless in Seattle's newsroom, things like that. But a lot of them do capture the newsroom, fairly perfectly. For instance, Spotlight. Have you seen Spotlight?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's interesting about Spotlight, and I'll mention a couple of other movies, there are newspaper movies that were made at places that I worked, and you can actually see my desk in those. The Spotlight is one of those. So if you've seen Spotlight, anybody who's not familiar with Spotlight should go and watch it. This is shortly before. It's fantastic. It's at the Boston Globe. It's in Boston. It's shortly before the Spotlight team, which is the investigative reporting team of the Boston Globe, broke open the Catholic diocese scandal about abuse within the Catholic Church. A hugely impactful story. That happened about 6 months before I started working at the Globe. And so a lot of those quote unquote characters and people who were in the movie I worked with when I was at the Boston Globe. I worked with the Spotlight team on a couple of different investigative reporting things that they were doing. And so I recognized those people. And by the way, anybody who's ever seen the movie, Liev Schreiber playing Marty Baron is to a T. Like, it is it's almost eerie how well he captures Marty's mannerisms and things. But that one captures the newsroom. I think obviously it's got some Hollywood feel to it as well. The ratcheting up the tension and looking over your shoulder and seeing who's up. But that's pretty real. I think the paper obviously was featuring the Washington Post is very clear and real view of the newsroom. And that one is actually captures the actual newsroom that I worked in as well. But then there's others that are a little more fantastical. You can see, if anybody knows Marley and Me, you can actually see some parts of that were shot at the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, and I recognize the newsroom and the hallway down where I used to work and everything. It's just weird sometimes when these movies come out, and I'm like, oh wait, that's so and so's desk, or wait, that's my desk, So,
and so, what did you do in newspapers?
So when I first started, we started in South Florida at the Sun Sentinel. We called them graphics reporters is basically what we said, because we wanted people to understand that we were journalists and reporters, but we also did graphics. So we worked in the news art department, and I started basically from day one, working both daily graphics, but also long-term graphics. I specialized in information graphics, which we used to do a full page. It used to be called Science Page, but now, or we turned it into the News Illustrated page. So we would go in depth about not only topics that we thought were interesting for people, but also topical things like when the Firestone tires were shredding on I-95 because everything was so hot. I had to do a full page graphic in literally 3 days, which is the quickest turnaround I'd had to do on that kind of project, just so we could show people why it's happening, what they could do to prevent it. And so that's what I started doing. And then after I left the South Florida Sun Sentinel, I actually became the daily art director of the Washington Post. And so in that instance, I was managing a team of artists, cartographers, and designers, basically for the daily production of the newspaper. And I also did some long-term graphics as well over time, especially after 9/11, and we started getting into the Afghani conflict and things like that.
So long-term graphics are what?
So long-term graphics are, so if you think about a daily graphics like breaking news, so if you had something that happened that was, an explosion somewhere, or something that needed to go on the front page because it was breaking for either the area or for the United States, like for instance the Columbia disaster, things like that. Those are ones that you consider daily graphics that you would basically pump out in a day. Long-term graphics are ones that are more the investigative reporting. Like for instance, if we're talking again about Spotlight of course had to put together their case for a long time and then produce the story. And that's very similar to a long-term graphic where you are researching for quite a while, producing it for quite a while, and then it comes out a little bit later. It can still be topical, but it takes longer.
And so, as you said, you joined the Washington Post, and you joined just before 9/11. So, firstly, what was it like being in Washington on that day? And secondly, what was it like being in the newspaper office in the aftermath of 9/11 and the approach to the Afghan war?
Yeah, it was definitely an incredible and crazy experience. I mean, horrible, obviously, but yeah, that morning, Michael Keegan, who was the top tier, who managed both the art department and the design department, things like that, he called me at home and he said that you need to turn on the television. And so I did immediately, and we watched the second tower fall. And by the time I was almost on the ground, I had just thrown on some clothes because I was basically first responder because I lived 5 blocks from the post. And so I jumped right out the door and started, heading as quickly as I could to the office. And I heard people were just like, it was bedlam. People had their cars were stopped. They were trying to get cell phone signals. People were looking around because you didn't know, because they were talking about possible planes headed to Washington. Still can't, memory's a funny thing. I can't be sure that this is what it was, but I heard like a rumble and a loud boom. And so I think that by the time I got to the post, I'd actually heard the Pentagon get hit. And for anybody who knows the layout of DC, Pentagon, I mean, it's close, but it's not that close. But the explosion, a lot of people talked about they had heard or felt it, 10 or 15 miles away. Again, don't take that with a grain of salt, because it was just such bedlam that it could have been a trash truck backing into somebody or something. I don't know. But by the time I got to the newsroom, of course, anybody who could make it in quickly had, and anyone who lived outside the city, they weren't going to make it in. They locked the city down. And so any of us who lived actually inside the Beltway, and probably even closer than that, inside the actual city limits, were the ones that had to put the paper out. And it was like that for quite a while. And I didn't have a day off for about 3.5 weeks. I would work and get about 4 hours sleep and go in and cover everything as best I could. It was about 3.5 weeks. And when you work in that kind of situation, especially as a journalist, you have a trench mentality. You just kind of shut things down and get the job done. You don't think about exactly what's happening. It's a compartmentalization type of thing. And so it took me 3.5 weeks to even sit down and really watch things and process them.
And sort of what was the feeling? So it's very interesting because, I was in England at the time, And in England, there was this feeling that the British should not go into a sort of international jaunt with the Americans, and the government were quite at odds with the people on that. I mean, what was the feeling within the paper? Was there this feeling, now we have to go and revenge ourselves on this people? Was it quite hawkish there?
Not in the newspaper. You know, the Post, and I still feel this way about the Post. The Post is very, I'm trying to think of the right word. The Post is very tight-knit about its objectivity. We want to report the facts. We don't want to get too caught up in the politics of things. We want to report that and then allow the reader. This is the way it should be. It's not the way it always is in the world today, but allow the reader to infer or to figure out, kind of their own, could draw their own conclusions and make up their own mind. So during that time, yes, we were surrounded by this. And there was, of course, it's the patriotism, and, we've got to hunt down Al Qaeda, and we've got to seek revenge for America. It's not really, you don't really have that kind of like talk or atmosphere in the newsroom, or at least I didn't when I was there. That might be different for papers nowadays. I hope it's not, and I really don't think it is for some like the Washington Post and New York Times. But outside the paper, of course, you obviously had friends and relatives and things like that were talking constantly on like, well, we're not doing enough to seek out Al Qaeda, we're not doing enough to find Bin Laden, all these different things. But inside the paper, it was a little more insular of, okay, we're taking this information in, we're processing it, and we're going to put it out in such a way that the readers are informed and that they can process it themselves.
And so you worked within journalism for 14 years. Why did you leave?
Well, at the time, so I was at the Globe for about 2 years. I wanted to stay a little bit longer, but the Globe had, shortly before I started, been purchased by the New York Times. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just that the Times and New York mentality is very different than a New England mentality. New England, Boston Globe being the gateway to New England, really, it's a different feel. It's a very tight-knit community. They had this kind of sense of, togetherness that is a little bit different than that New York City mentality. And so I don't think the Times really knew exactly what to do with the Globe. And unfortunately, I started to see the writing on the wall that things were changing, and not necessarily changing for the best, in my opinion. So I took a year contract to move back down to South Florida to help that newsroom, that news art department, to get back up to where they were when I was there before. But at that point, I started seeing that was started to be the decline of newspapers. People weren't sure what was going to happen. I think that we're in a better place now today than we were when I left, but I started thinking, I need to consider other avenues and use my skills still in the same way, but possibly look outside of newspapers, which is what I did.
So your next game then, we've already talked about it, and that's Car Wars. So is this the archetypal Ameritrash game?
Yeah, probably. Some of those Milton Bradley ones I mentioned before, Axis and Allies and Fortress America, I think are a little bit more, they're a little bit easier to parse as the Ameritrash game. I think the full-on Ameritrash game, it's hard, it's one of those things. It's like art, when you see it. An Ameritrash game for me is mostly like dudes on a map and dice and things like that. Now, of course, Car Wars has cars on a map and dice. And so I think, yes, it does have a lot of that DNA. And I do think it has much more DNA with the sort of Ameritrash than it does European mentality of game design. So, yeah, I would say it paved the way for sure. There was a lot of Avalon Hill games at the time that also shared some of that DNA, and so people were starting to really adapt and get used to that sort of the Ameritrash, fully thematic, dice chucking combat type of things.
And in your podcast, you talk a lot about Euro games, and yet you're someone for whom theme seems to be integral.
I love theme
games.
Yes.
I mean, how thematic is Car Wars?
Oh, very thematic. I mean, it's finding Car Wars especially when I was a kid and I was 10 years old in 1984, it just hit the 10-year-old mentality. I mean, you had guns on cars and you're driving around shooting at each other. What could be cooler, And especially growing up watching James Bond and, Death Race 2000, things like that. It's, it's just one of those things that the theme, it was obviously they chose the theme first, and that's something we talk about some too. There are theme forward games and there are mechanic forward games. And I think for a majority of Ameritrash games were theme forward games versus mechanic forward games. Now, that's not to say that some of them don't have great mechanics, but it's mostly about the theme and making people feel like they're embedded in the theme. A lot of European-centric design is more mechanic forward, and the theme comes afterwards. That's not to say that some themes aren't great, but that tends to be the dividing line between the more American-centric thought of design versus European-centric thought of design. For me, I love theme, but it doesn't mean I don't like a good dry soulless Euro either.
And so when you sent me the email with your list of games, you specifically stated that this is the 6th edition that you want to take to the cabin. How has the game evolved during its iterations?
Well, the 6th edition has streamlined a lot. The reason why I would want to choose, there's a certain freedom for the previous iterations of Car Wars because they're made for, we're in a different design space now than we used to be back in the 70s and 80s. A lot of people were expected to remember results charts and modifiers and all these different things. I also used to play very heavily Warhammer 40K. And that, of course, has evolved a ton over the years. And with the same thing with Car Wars, it has evolved to a way where, templates have been simplified, modifiers have been simplified, the overall rules have been streamlined. They've been working on the 6th edition of Car Wars. I've been begging Phil Reed over at Steve Jackson Games to give more information about Car Wars since 2009. And finally, they put it out, and I bought everything, obviously, because it's Car Wars. And the reason why I chose 6th edition, though, is I think that and I do assume in this cabin in the woods that there will be people to play with.
Yeah. I mean, me at minimum, which well, exactly. Fairly nightmarish, but still.
But I feel like anybody, no matter what, if I wanted to convince them to play Car Wars, it would have to be 6th edition because taking in all the rule set of any of the previous iterations of Car Wars is it's a lot. And so that's why I chose 6th edition. Now, 6th edition doesn't have quite as much freedom for your customization of cars and so on and so forth, but it is a fantastic production. There's a lot of stuff, so I'm going to have a truck to get all the stuff to the cabin, but I think I would choose 6th edition.
So let's move on then to what you're most well known for in the world of games, and this is Dice Hate Me. So you've kind of touched on it, but why start a game company?
I'm insane. That's why. I just, it's been in my blood. As a kid, like I mentioned before, I would redesign games or, add, like, for instance, Hero Quest. I loved Hero Quest, but then I used the modular board layout to create a gladiator game. So you could take the different, not only the base archetype heroes, but then I had miniatures and things. So I have okay, here's a hobbit or halfling rather. Sorry, I don't want to get in trouble with the Tolkien people, but things like that where they would have different cards they could play and weapons they could play and specialties and things like that. It just was in my blood. And in the late 90s, with a friend of mine who also worked in newspapers, we formed sort of a sandbox company, which was a multimedia production company. He was a big Shockwave programmer, and I was involved both with graphic design, but also game design and game theory. So we just formed a company and started tinkering with doing Shockwave games, more intense Shockwave games. And also he helped to develop one of the first peer-to-peer systems. In other words, so we could have sort of a massive multiplayer online system way before any of the MMOs came around. Now, it wasn't perfect, obviously, but it allowed for a world that people could coexist in at the same time, sort of like an old MUD with a text-based dungeon adventure. Anyway, long story short, we had gotten a contract from this company called Gameloft in Canada in 2001, and we were about to sign a pretty big contract with them, and then the internet bust happened. And so they backed out. And so we just kind of had to shelve the company and send it more to a sandbox. And I had ideas for games I'd want to do. So over the years, I would just still stay involved with gaming. But then around 2008, I really started getting back heavily into tabletop gaming. And when in 2010, I was just feeling like I wanted to stretch my journalistic roots again. So that's why I started Dice Hate Me. And that led down the rabbit hole of, hey, it is actually feasible to create your own game company because of Kickstarter. And I was like, all right, why not? Give it a shot. And so I was like, sure, all right. And I'm still crazy for doing it because it is not easy. But it over the years, it's created a lot of good memories and a lot of good games, so it was worth it.
And so the USP of Dice Hate Me was Americana. And as I sort of mentioned Norman Rockwell at the beginning, that sort of down-home feeling when I think of Bottom of the Ninth, it really evokes that sort of 50s Americana feel. What was the reason for this? Was this that you saw a niche in the market, or was it because it's something that you love, or was it a bit of both?
It was a bit of both, really. Primarily because Carnival was our first release. Carnival was my dad was a huge Carnival fan. I love Carnivals as well, but sort of like just a feel that I had, and also that old retro. Every single Dice Hate Me game set in a different era. Like I would say the Carnival set in the 20s and 30s, it's kind of got this rough rundown Carnival look to it. But it matches my design aesthetic. So, but also just my love for that kind of those different eras. It allowed me to stretch my design aesthetic because I could get to play in those different eras in design instances that I wouldn't normally be able to. But also, especially at the time, I was like, well, there's not a whole lot of these out there. We don't have a ton of kind of a retro Americana or even Americana. The Dice Hate Me aesthetic for me is sort of a cross between the Americentric design with theme forward plus the awesome mechanics of, Eurocentric design, and creating that hybrid with approachable themes allowed, thankfully us to reach people that wouldn't normally consider either one or one over the other, but they got both. And so that sort of niche plus my design aesthetic just kind of came together. It was a perfect storm.
And so the company rattled along sort of fairly well for a while, and then you went into a merger with Greater Than Games. Why did you do this?
Well, oh man, there was a couple of different reasons. One is that we had basically grown up in the same space. Sentinels of the Multiverse, which was the flagship game, still is, except for Spirit Island, hit Kickstarter about the same time Carnival did. So we were in that same space together. We knew each other from at conventions. We had sort of a similar, philosophy as far as, at least back then, as far as like what we wanted out of the game space. And it just made sense after talking through it that we didn't know at the time what was going to happen with the industry. The industry was getting bigger. I mean, it's huge now, but it was getting bigger, and we didn't know if there might be sort of a bubble burst. We didn't know if there was going to be a coming storm that we might want to weather, and we knew that we probably stood a better chance together than apart. And so because of that, we just started talking about it, and kind of one thing led to another. I think that it was nice for me because I would have more support. Also, I could depend on their multi-user LLC to help with taxes, whereas myself just running the company was a sole proprietorship. Now I'm an LLC now that I've reformed. However, it still manages a sole proprietorship. So taxes are a nightmare. That's beside the point. But yeah, at the time, it seemed like a really good idea because I would have more support, wouldn't have to manage every single thing myself, and I could focus more on the creative side of the company rather than the creative / business all at the same time.
And so, were there drawbacks to the merger? Did you feel like you'd lost control of your baby to an extent?
Absolutely. Yes. And it became more and more evident as longer that I stayed with Greater Than Games. When we first merged, everybody was excited. They had great ideas, reprints, new cool things to do in the Dice Hate Me world. But it soon became evident that the philosophy wasn't quite the same. People, for whatever reason, weren't quite under. I mean, obviously, since it's my baby and I understand my aesthetic better than anybody, they didn't quite understand or have the same mentality as far as like I did, as far as the Americana aesthetic, how exactly to handle it. There were even, just I'll throw an example. Greater Than Games loves theme, obviously, but they love like character theme. Like, obviously with the Sentinels in the Multiverse, you imbue different superheroes. Well, in the Dice Hate Me world, you're the hero. Like all the games that I'd produced up until that point, and through New Bedford that I produced with them, there were no like characters. When you sat down, you might have a different board that gives you different, like for instance, in Viva Java and Brewcrafters, you could have a different research board that allows you to do something a little different than somebody else, but you're the person who's playing that game. To me, I think that's a very important part of that aesthetic because you are imbued with becoming that character in the game. It's emergent storytelling. And I like emergent storytelling because every game's a little different, and you're going to have a different game depending on which personality you bring in. If you dedicate a game with certain characters that only have certain play styles, and you have to become that character instead of yourself, that's totally fine with merit as far as RPGs and games like Sentinels in the Multiverse. But when you're sitting down to play a Dice Hate Me game, it's like you want to be able to bring your own personality to it, and that was a different mentality going forward. There were, I also lost control as far as like the brand itself. And I won't mention names, but we'd hired a marketing director, and after she started, we started getting into Legends of Sleepy Hollow, a hugely thematic game, which does have characters, but it had characters for a reason because there was a story behind it. And I found out shortly before the Kickstarter started that the Dice Hate Me Games logo wasn't going on the front of the box. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, so-and-so has decided that we probably should just nix the brand. And I was like, well, nobody talked to me about that. So we had a heart-to-heart about that, and that's where the Dice Hate Me Studio idea came about, that we would keep the brand but make it more of a studio. So if something was worked on, it was still under the umbrella of Greater Than Games, but then it would be a studio production, but then obviously the logo on the back of the box and so on and so forth. That was the beginning of the realizing that there was a very different vision, and some of the wheels started falling off the wagon, so to speak. It's not 100% anybody's fault in this manner, because the fact is that the Greater Than Games headquarters is located in St. Louis, and I obviously live in North Carolina. There were reasons that I did not want to move to St. Louis, primarily my mother. And so there is the old adage of out of sight, out of mind. It is true. I would constantly try to be in touch and want to be involved in decisions, not only for the company, but games. It's easier for them to just get up and walk to another office to talk to someone, but they would have to make an effort to talk to me via Skype or Slack or anything else. And so it became pretty evident that I was the last to know about almost everything. And that was tough. That was really tough.
And so you've recently parted ways. Why did that happen, and was there any bad blood involved?
Well, first of all, I'll just put out there was no bad blood. I mean, obviously, whenever you're partners with people in a business, there's going to be disagreements. And we had our disagreements. And that's probably one of the reasons why I wanted to part. Another thing you mentioned was control. I just felt like the Dice Hate Me brand had laid dormant for quite a while because of stories about Legends of Sleepy Hollow that I'm not going to go into depth about at all, but that was really the backbreaker. Working really hard on a project and then having the other team decide they want to go a different direction with it after you've spent 3 years working on something. That was really, part of the reason why, I decided that I wanted to be separate. Now, the opportunity, it wasn't, necessarily that I was like putting forth, okay, well, I'm just going to leave. I wanted to wait because I wanted to see how things panned out. But of course, the opportunity presented itself when Flat River Group offered to purchase Greater Than Games. And as part of that deal, I negotiated the return of the Dice Hate Me brand to me, and all the titles except for Compounded and Bottom of the Ninth and Legends of Sleepy Hollow. But that was, and the reason to separate was, again, for control, but also, it was just time. And again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make Dice Hate Me games successful again. It's been hard so far. It's been a rough summer trying to get things started back up. But at the same time, I'm like, if I don't try, then I'll regret it for the rest of my life. At least if I try and for some reason it doesn't work out, then that's okay. I'll move on to something else. And I had a great run, but I'll do it my way.
And how exciting is it to have Dice Hate Me back in your own hands?
It's exciting and terrifying. It's exciting because it's something. I mean, unless Asmodee comes along and offers me $10 million, I will never give this brand up again.
I mean, it's tattooed on your body.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. So I feel like that if that is the case, and as a matter of fact, I need to get this tattoo touched up just looking at it. But no matter what, even if Dice Hate Me Games is not viable as a company, I will still be Dice Hate Me online. On Twitter, I'll podcast with people. I may go back to just doing primarily, reviews and things like I used to back in the old days. Treating it more like a hobby than a company, but at least I'll still be Dice Hate Me, and it'll just be me, which is exciting. I mean, it's exciting to have the opportunity to bring my company back, but it's also exciting just to know that for the rest of my life it will be there, and I've learned sort of a lesson out of all this.
So your next game then is one of those Dice Hate Me games, and it's New Bedford. Why, out of the Dice Hate Me titles, is this the one you're taking to the cabin?
That's a great question, and I'm going to catch some flack from TC Petty.
And he lives just down the hall as well.
Exactly. He's right in the next door over there. Yeah. So I love TC's design. The Viva Job is one of my favorite games of all time. The reason why I chose New Bedford is because of how it plays. It kind of embodies almost every aspect of the Dice Hate Me aesthetic, in the fact that it is definitely historical Americana, but also it's what I like to call 1 hour wonder. It plays in 60 minutes or less. 5-player game could run it slightly longer than 60 minutes. It's also approachable for people. It includes awesome Euro mechanics that some people are familiar with, but some aren't, and so they can get various things out of the game. You can also play it solo with a fantastic AI system. It just has a lot of flexibility, and it was also a really good production. And it was tough for me because I knew I wanted to include a Dice Hate Me Games title, and it was really hard for me to decide. But I think that not only did it made sense because I could play it solo if I wanted to, but also it's one of those that in this situation I could get others to play and understand and want to play more, because it is I never get tired of playing it.
And see, it's got a very idiosyncratic theme. And firstly, was there any hesitation about publishing a game about whaling? And secondly, did you get flack for it?
First of all, yes, huge hesitation about putting out a game about whaling. And 2, yes, I did get flack for it. I felt like in the end that it was worth taking the chance for a couple reasons. One, it is a slice of American history that actually, without it, regardless of the unfortunate circumstances of whaling, without that period in history, we would have never reached the Industrial Revolution. We were very dependent on whale oil for lighting candles and powering all kinds of different things. And luckily we found other, sources than whale. Of course, unfortunately, one of those was coal, but, it was a time in American history that really led to us as a nation breaking forth out of that 1850s to 60s model fully on into the Industrial Revolution. So it's a very seminal portion of American history that some people don't always, understand or realize. But the other reason why I felt like it was important was that it also carried an environmental message to it. Now, it wasn't one that, where we're going to ram it down everybody's throats. We made it emergent and allowed people to understand and include notes about it for people. But the environmental portion of one of the mechanics of whaling is that the more you whale, the more empty sea you come up with. So it actually demonstrates the depopulation of the whale species as there was more whaling going on. So it was a very emergent mechanic that also allowed us to show the environmental impact through the history as well, which I thought was very important. So two different reasons for those being important. As far as catching flack, yes. I mean, obviously. I think that a lot of people, after I explained the message of environmental impact, they started to soften a bit and realize, okay, well, you may have a point here, but there were always going to be hardliners that are just like, they will not play a game about whaling, and I don't blame them. I really don't. I mean, if you don't like a theme, it is a controversial theme, but at the same time, I think that we handled it, with respect and with carefulness. And in the end, I don't think it doesn't glorify whaling. It just simply, again, is a snapshot, and it also has a message of the environmental behind it. So I think that it was successful as a game and as a piece of the marketplace.
And so, how would you get people to play this if they're they're not a hardliner, but they're like, ugh, killing whales? I mean, how would you pitch it to get people to play this?
I've pitched it, and a lot of fans have pitched it as well as catch and release. Mm-hmm. It's basically playing a fishing game where you catch and release. No whales were harmed in the making of this game, but that's only going to go so far. I mean, some people are just simply not going to play because of the theme. And, it is a shame at the same time, but at the same time, I cannot blame them. I will try to convince them that, like, again, this can be considered, nonviolent or just an exercise in showing. It's more like a simulation, really, I think, is one of the things we talked about. Let's say there was a simulation of what happened in history. It's sort of the same thing. With the game itself, it's a simulation to show what exactly happened in both the development of New Bedford, but also in the depopulation of the whale species.
So I want to go on now and talk about the state of games, both the podcast and the actual thing. So firstly, why start a podcast?
Boredom. No, I mean, it was kind of like...
It's because you're a middle-aged man. That's what it is. That is our birthright to start
It is our birthright to have our voice heard on a podcast. Well, I'm trying to think, I guess, when would you consider middle-age starts? But yeah, probably your late 30s. That's when I think we started in February 2011. So I would have been 37, 38. So yeah, you're right. That's exactly when usually the podcasts start. And it was interesting because, I really wanted to just expand and have some fun. I mean, not to bring astrology into this, but, I'm a Gemini, so I like to do a lot of different things. I'm into a lot of different things. I'm also into, mental pursuits and creative pursuits. And, I was like, I liked writing for dicehateme.com, but at the same time, I thought it might be fun to do a podcast. And also, it would start to generate a community that we could possibly use later for Kickstarter, which we did. Now, I started the podcast with my ex-wife, Sherilyn, and it was just us two for quite a while. And it was very popular. People, we came up with some really good topics to talk about. It was good to have, a woman's perspective. From Sherilyn's perspective, she was also Chinese American, so we could talk about some of the more, minority-based topics that were coming up and that were being, particularly sensitive back then, but also very sensitive now. So it just seemed to make sense. And it was why I thought it was a good idea at the time.
And so, Plaid Hat did this and you did this, and I'm sure other companies did this. I mean, how useful was it to have a dedicated show?
It was very useful, especially in the very beginning. We had a lot of dedicated fans, a very dedicated community. Since then, listenership has dropped off, but I think that it's also dropped off across the board. Podcasts are not quite as, especially since the pandemic. Podcast listenership across the board, from what I can tell from everyone, has dipped some because a lot of the people always admitted to us that they listened to us on their commute. Now, of course, there is a more captive audience kind of feel because people had nowhere else to go, so they would sit and maybe listen to a podcast. But it was very useful, especially back in the day, and it's still useful now to keep people up to date on, what the design process is, what's coming up. I think that especially since the pandemic, it has become more of just a discussion platform for TC and Daryl and I and anybody else that might be a guest on the podcast, just to talk about the general state of things. But yeah, it was extremely, extremely useful in the beginning, and it still is now. It's just not quite as effective as it was, 10 years ago.
And so you've mentioned Daryl Lauder, who's the designer of Compounded, the lordly TC Petty, who needs no introduction. I mean, to what degree now is the podcast an excuse to get your friends on the phone and have a chat?
It is. It's a very, very big excuse for us. Yeah, exactly. It's more like, and a lot of people still respond to that. They say that when they listen to the State of Games, sounds like 3 or 4 friends just catching up, and that's exactly what it is. Because even though TC lives here, we only see each other sometimes like ships passing in the night, because he's got so much going on, and I'm here and there and everywhere, and so even catching up with TC, but especially with Daryl, since he lives in St. Louis now, and just trying to catch up with him. Yeah, it is an excuse for that. It definitely is. But I think that's actually a strength for the podcast, because people feel that there's a camaraderie, but also it's like they're just listening in on some friends chatting.
And so, sort of broadly on the state of games, then. So I'm going to tell you an anecdote that that I want to highlight the question that I'm going to ask. The other week, I was looking for a review of a game because I was unsure whether to buy it or not. And I have a mental Rolodex of people who do reviews on YouTube. And more, I see that YouTube channels that offer reviews should have inverted commas around the word review. More and more, they seem to be like marketing outlets for publishers. And I literally could not find a review of this particular game from a source that I considered reputable, objective, and frankly honest about what they would think about the game. Now, you've mentioned about being a journalist and having journalistic ethics. I mean, to what degree do you think, with especially the Instagramification of game content, to what degree do you think objectivity, honesty, and sort of authenticity around the criticism of games is going out of the window?
It has been on a long, not slow, I would say even long. It's been on a quick decline. I mean, definitely. You hit the nail on the head right there, because especially the Instagramification, you've definitely came across that one. I think that since the sort of Instagram, quote unquote, influencer mentality and community has come along, and that's not to say there aren't, good ones on Instagram, things like that, but a majority of things you see are, people who either are being paid for their review or are doing it for, I hate to say this, free copies of things or exposure to increase their community. And that's, to be honest with you, that's just the nature of things. I mean, it's not like I haven't done the same thing as far as like, what sometimes with the State of Games, I'm like, this is the new hotness. We probably should play it so we can talk about it. But
surely there's a fundamental difference between playing it and taking pictures of you smiling next to the box and kind of not really talking about what you think of the game, and playing it and saying, I loved this, or crikey, this is overrated. Right?
Now that's the big distinction that you've definitely made, is that I see so many just of like, hey, look, I have a game. I'm going to hold it up and I'm going to smile. And it's like, well, what do you think about it? And I don't see a lot of that. They don't have, there's not that critical dissection. And I think that like 10 years ago, we had quite a few people who were doing that. Now you're right. It's very hard for me to find someone who's going to give that objective and critical dissection. It is, there's a big distinction there, and you're right. And it's something that's kind of fallen by the wayside. I also feel like for the most part, which is why I feel like, if Dice Hate Me Games doesn't work out, I will go back to doing Dice Hate Me reviews, but I'm going to do them primarily the way I used to and do them in written, because I go on board. I'll tell you what, I could watch a YouTube video, but I would much rather read a review. I mean, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I can skim a review. I can I can jump ahead very easily, see what their thought is, jump back. It's there, and there's not a lot. And also there's no SEO to that either. When you're doing YouTube videos, when you're doing written, somebody can do a search for, blah, blah, blah. My old Twilight Struggle video. Article has been spread all over the internet because it's what people can read really quickly. I just feel like it's a lost form. It does take longer, but I think it's something that's missed. And I think it's something that a lot of people have missed and they want to see more of.
So your next game then is one that you're a big fan of, and this is Fleet. And you often talk about it on the podcast, and you always mention that it was a Dice Hate Me Game of the Year. Why did it win that prestigious title?
It's just awesome. It's just a great game. It was, Matt and Ben reached out to me. That was their first game. They had been listening to the podcast, had known Dice Hate Me for a little bit, and reached out to me and said, do you want to check out this advanced copy? And I was like, fishing? Heck yeah, I'm in. Let's go, And it hit on all cylinders for me. Some people don't like this sort of auction/bidding aspect of Fleet, in particular, the original Fleet game. I love it, but sometimes you can really catch yourself. There's always the end joke of like, Chris is going to overbid for shrimp. And well, yeah, usually I do. So, but it also has that combo, I call it the combo-tastic feel. It's like, here, I'm going to do my thing. You do it, and then afterwards you feel smart. And games that do that, they trigger a part of your brain that makes you want to do it more. And Fleet captures that perfectly. And it was everything I was looking for, especially in a game for that year, but I still love playing it. But I also mentioned, obviously, in my notes that I had Fleet/Fleet Wharfside/Fleet Dice. They all bring different things to the table, but they all still bring that combo-tastic feel that makes your brain feel like, okay, I can do this, and I can play off this, I can get points off this, and then you get done, you're like, that felt good.
But what you're missing out is what you actually wrote on the email, and I've pulled it up, so I will quote. Can't decide, we'll have to make a game time decision. Well, you're the one who suggested it, so which one is it going to be out of the Fleet team?
I think it's going to be Fleet Dice. It is the richest of the selections. It's one that, again, you can also play solo. But it's a roll and write. I really enjoy roll and writes, but it includes, again, that combo-tastic feel that you get from Fleet and Wharfside. Wharfside's more compact and I think more sleek. But I like Fleet Dice, and also I like rolling dice. Who doesn't like rolling dice? I mean, they hate me, but I love rolling the dice. And I think that it's also one that could appeal to people and get them involved because of the dice choosing aspect. It's just a really well done game, and I think that with the way that I feel like I feel bad even taking that, because I'm like, do I have a card game like Fleet in my collection? I don't right now, as far as like what I'm going to take. So it's very tough, but I'm going to have to go Fleet Dice.
And so, how important are Ben Pitchback and Matt Riddle to the American design community, do you think?
Very, especially at least for the hobby market that we know today. They've produced a lot of, and what's interesting about Matt and Ben, and I'll just say right off the bat, is that Ben is more, they're both very mechanically minded. They both understand Euro mechanics very well. They have computer brains that can process things much better than I can a lot of times. But Ben is a little bit more of getting into the theme, and Matt's just a little bit of we're about theme later, and we'll get into the mechanics. I think that because of the combination between the two, they've been very important to the American world of games. Their designs are all super solid. They always make sure that they play test them to the nth degree. So when you get them, you get their products, you know that it's going to be good because they have made sure that they are solid and they're tested. Matt and Ben have both admitted, like, they probably would have sold more of the Fleet series of things if it was a slightly different theme. TC says the same thing. Myself, I'm like, I don't care. I want fishing. I want to go out on boats. I want to go fishing, but that's me. So, the market's a little bit different, but I do think it's been very important, especially their design space and the games that they bring to people, and also just their designers, like the game designers who look at Matt and Ben's systems and what they've designed over the years. Like when you have an actor's actor, it's the same thing. They're a designer's designer.
So they're the Paul Giamatti of the American game world.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good quote.
So I want to talk now about the future. So you've mentioned, you've got Dice Hate Me back. I mean, when will Dice Hate Me re-enter the market?
Well, the stock that I have currently will re-enter the market as soon as I can manage to get this web store back up and running. But as far as new releases, the first one we're going to do is Josh Mills' Milkman, which has been sitting around for 5 years.
You've been talking about it for a long time.
A long time. And it's one that I've kept pushing. It's another one of the reasons why, I eventually wanted to part with Greater Than Games, because they just would have these projects and they would just languish. They just sit there, and some of the projects would be canceled. And now, because of the delay, I've lost Isle of Trains. Isle of Trains, All Aboard went to another publisher. And that was going to be the flagship. I was going to relaunch Dice Hate Me with All Aboard, because people love Isle of Trains and they recognize it, but it's too late now. But Josh Mills' Milkman, we're going to try to either do it late this fall, or depending on the art and when it comes in, maybe January. But it'll have to be in the next, 5 months, because I need, obviously I need some capital. I need to keep the company going. That'll be our first release. As long as it's viable, 2023, we'll probably see maybe 3 releases other than Milkman, if I can swing it. Those Meddling Kids is on deck. We just have to, obviously it's going to cost a lot for art, so I need to make sure that I have capital incoming and I can pay for that. I would like to do a reissue, and this is a scoop for you, and it's not a done deal, but I've talked about it with Jason Katarski. I'd like to do an anniversary. It would be the 10th anniversary re-release of Great Harlan Hall and Company, but as a rooster, which is compounded / New Bedford size, with tiles and upgraded components, and just kind of deck it out. And anyway, we're also talking possibly about a re-release of Brewcrafters. We've got a lot of things that I'd like to do. It just depends on if I'm able to keep that capital rolling and do them.
And so when you obviously, I assume you do crowdfunding, but GameFound has emerged in the last few years as a sort of another viable option. Will you stick with Kickstarter, or will you go on to GameFound?
That is a very good question, and I have not honestly had the full time and attention to devote to comparing the numbers between the two. Obviously, I'm much more familiar with Kickstarter, but I have backed a couple of things on GameFound. I've seen that a lot of publishers are using that platform for slightly different types of releases that they might normally do on Kickstarter. I think it's a completely viable platform to use. Now, is it going to be as successful for, let's say, me as Kickstarter? Possibly. It might be a way for me to actually start from scratch and start over. But at the same time, I have so many things on Kickstarter that I can point to that have been successful. I don't know. It's not something I haven't decided quite yet.
And so, imagine a world in which, with Dice Hate Me, everything goes kind of the way you want it to go. Mm-hmm. What do you want Dice Hate Me to be?
I want it to be what it used to be. I want it to stand for a certain niche. It doesn't, again, I don't have any aspirations to be, the next Asmodee. I'm totally fine doing what I call boutique publishing. I mean, all of the games are always going to be fantastic and they're going to have great production values, but they might be a small print run. And I want Dice Hate Me to be that kind of same. I mean, it can't be the same as it was 8 years ago, but at the same time, I feel like just me running the company is enough to keep the company going and still maintain that mentality and that aesthetic of what I know Dice Hate Me games can be. And then there are certain people who just, they resonate with those aesthetics. You know, people who want to play a trucking game or want to play a game about making beer, drinking coffee. You know, I want to try to still, there are a lot of companies out there now doing the Americana themes, and they're doing well. I want to maintain that and still keep it within the realm of the Dice Hate Me universe, I call it, that people understand and know, and bring in more people to enjoy that kind of niche, that kind of thematic market. But, you know, we'll see. I don't know. Maybe there's too many games in the market to compete with it. I mean, we've got things like Cascadia and Parks and things like that now that are, they're behemoths.
And so your final game then is, and I'm not surprised to see this on the list. This is Arkham Horror 2nd Edition. First of all, why the 2nd edition?
I feel like it's the truest to Richard Launius, who's the designer, truest to Richard's vision. I mean, he created Arkham Horror 1st Edition back in the 80s, you know, and it's fun. You know, he's come a long way as a designer since then. It's fun to play because it's just, sometimes we call it the parade of horrors, but sometimes there'll be, you know, monsters that get loose in Arkham and they just keep moving around. You get stuck in a location. It's just hilarious. But 2nd edition, I choose 2nd edition because I feel like that the story is deeper. I think that sometimes it can be more emergent. There's more going on in the game. Obviously, it's more complex to play than 3rd and 4th edition. So I would say the Eldritch Horror is 3rd edition. A 4th edition, obviously, Arkham Horror it came out about 3 years ago, and then you've got Final Hour, which is a lot of fun. Final Hour is actually a lot of fun, but it's just more. Final Hour is honestly a 1 hour wonder. It plays really quickly. But of all of those, I even include Arkham Horror, the card game, which I think is a fantastic game. This one is Richard's vision, and the story is fun. It's deeper. It's more concentrated because it does focus on Arkham, but all the storylines that happen are focused very clearly on Lovecraftian influences, where Eldritch Horror is world spanning. Now, it's fun. I enjoy playing Eldritch Horror, and it's actually very streamlined and easier to play, but the storyline's not as compact. It's not as focused. Arkham Horror 4th edition, the storyline is just kind of disjointed. It doesn't stick together as well. I don't like the mechanics as well. So to me, out of all those editions, and of course, I have to have Arkham Horror with me in the cabin because I can't live without Arkham Horror. And what I'm going to take, obviously, I'm going to take 2nd edition.
And you worked with Richard on Fate of the Elder Gods. Mm-hmm. Is Richard Launius a legend in the world of game design?
Yes, to a lot of people. I think there's a younger generation that's coming up now that aren't as familiar with his work. What was fascinating is, you know, I met Richard at Origins of 2011, and, you know, I was a huge fan of Arkham Horror before then, and I'd even played the original Arkham Horror back in the day. And also, I'd wanted to play Defenders of the Realm. I hadn't got a chance, and so just by happenstance, I just lucked into, hey, do you want to play a Meet the Designer game of Defenders of the Realm with Richard Launius? I'm like, are you kidding? Yeah. So met up and played with him and Stephen Avery and a couple other people that were in his pretty close playtest group at the time, but then it was me and my buddy Sean, and just had an absolute blast. And it was, you know, I just felt like I'd met one of my heroes, and he turned out to be an amazing guy. And I think a lot of people over the years, as they've met Richard and gotten more familiar with his work, realize the same thing. So yes, he is kind of a legend of America, especially American game design. He's always funny talking about, you know, Euro games, and he's like, I don't understand this mechanic. Why does this mechanic exist? I'm like, well, you know, we kind of talk back and forth. He's like, well, why don't you just roll a die? And I'm like, Richard, come on. You can't just roll a die for everything. But he's great.
And so with Arkham Horror 2nd Edition, I mean, you're a Lovecraft fan. How well does this game evoke the feel of Lovecraft?
So Arkham Horror is interesting because in most Lovecraft games that are out now, I think evoke more the pulp kind of feel of Lovecraft, more so than the, cyclopean terror, the horror that you can't escape, the psychological portion of it. It does embody a lot of that as well, but it's more of the pulpy kind of thing. And I think that started with the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. Sometimes you would play an investigator or something like that in the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and it was a little bit more pulpy. And then sometimes every now and then it would take 2 minutes before you just completely lost your mind and you had to start a new character. So it started to line, between the Lovecraftian influences of some of his more bleak works, but also still got that sort of 1930s, 40s detective pulp into it as well. So yes, it does channel Lovecraft very well, but also it introduces, a little bit more adventure. Yeah.
So I've got one more question for you. So
Sure.
You're heading out of North Carolina to the cabin, and you go round a corner. The back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out of the car, down a ravine, into a river. I don't know if there are ravines in North Carolina. I'm just...
There are some, yes.
Into a ravine and are swept away to posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting on the back seat of the car?
It'll be the pack of poker cards I have in my pocket. No, I'm kidding. That was one of the things I put in it. No, it's not. I'm not cheating. I'll pick one of the 5. But if you had to take a pack of poker cards, I'm saying you can make a lot of games out of it. Oh, I read this in the notes, and all right, fine. Arkham Horror. I'll keep Arkham.
Excellent. So if people want to get hold of you and they want to find out what you're up to with Dice Hate Me, how can they go about doing that?
You can find me on Twitter at Dice Hate Me. I am also on Instagram. I don't just stand there and smile next to a game. I'll give you thoughts on my games from time to time, but I'm on Dice Hate Me on Instagram as well. Matter of fact, if you want to find me almost on any platform, if you put in Dice Hate Me, about 99% sure it's going to be me. So, but Twitter is always a great place if you want to come and just chat.
Brilliant. Well, Chris Kirkman, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me.
You can support the show in many ways. You can tell your friends. You can talk about it on social media. You can talk about it in your own blog, podcast, or video. Or you can support it directly by going to patreon.com/5G4D for a rolling donation, or for a one-off donation, hitting the PayPal link at the bottom of the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com. It's these donations that keep the show going. Also, if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on Twitter at 5gamesfordoomsday, or send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. And if I've managed to jog on from the 2-for-1 offers and all that jazz, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.